Hey guys, well, since I had to run out on you to go to my doctor's appointment, you get the pleasure of hearing me talk through this PowerPoint. I know it's so exciting for you. Um, please be good for whoever is in here, probably Miss Earnhardt. She knows you're a great class, but it is not fun to have to give up your planning period to watch another teacher's class, so please just be amazing for her. That means you should put away your phones. We will not be doing SSR today or a journal, so there is absolutely no reason you should have your phones. And please don't put Miss Earnhardt or whoever's in here in the position of having to take your phone. So just do what you're supposed to be doing. Also, be in your assigned seat. If you have not already done so, go ahead and get the 3 handouts that are in the chairs up front. One is called The Discussion of Peter Pan. It's an article. There is a stapled packet, and there is also a study guide. So you need those 3 things before we begin. Also, go ahead and get out a sheet of notebook paper. Have a little bit of notes that I want to go over, which is why I'm doing this video PowerPoint. But you'll need to write down everything that's in yellow that you see during this presentation. And you will have a quiz on it sometime next week, probably on Monday, but I'll tell you more about that tomorrow. But if you need to pause this video and take care of business, do so. Otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead and get started. So we are moving on to the fantasy genre. We have done picture books and children's books and all sorts of things, but now we're going to focus on just fantasy for the next week. And the definition of fantasy is that it uses magical and supernatural as part of the plot, theme, and/or setting. And really, a fantasy story steers clear of technology. That's kind of getting into science fiction, which we'll talk about too. But fantasy has its roots in mythology, and there's 2 types of fantasy. There's high fantasy, and then there's low fantasy. So, even though I told you to write what's in yellow, you perhaps might ought to write down that first bullet. Fantasy uses magic and supernatural as part of the plot, theme, and/or setting. So I'm going to pause here and go ahead and write the definition of fantasy down. If at any time I'm going too fast, obviously I'm not there to tell, but if somebody just pause the PowerPoint, write down what you need to get down, and that's the beauty of technology. You can use it at your own pace. So again, I only want you to write down what's in yellow. This is a lot on this slide, but I want to talk first about high fantasy and what that is. The difference really between high fantasy and low fantasy is that high fantasy is a story that the setting is completely in a made up world. Um, Obviously, it's not the real world. So the setting is completely made up. Some examples are C.S. Lewis in the Chronicles of Narnia, Narnia being the completely made up world, and Tolkien in Lord of the Rings, of course, the Shire and all of the things in Lord of the Rings is a completely made up setting. High fantasies typically are very serious in tone. Some people think fantasies are for kids, but they're very, very serious in their theme and their tone. And another element of high fantasy is that you see these fantastical elements such as elves and fairies and dwarves and magic and sorcery, wizards or magicians, invented languages, and also quests. Usually there is a hero, goes on a quest. It's very similar to an epic tale, but fantasy is still very popular in our culture today. There's lots of fantasy stories that are very popular. Harry Potter is one of them, which I'm going to talk about too in just a second. Another thing you need to know about high fantasy is that most fantasy storylines are told from the viewpoint of one main hero. Again, it sounds a lot like an epic. Often, much of the plot revolves around this hero's heritage. They don't know where they came from, maybe who their parents are, they have secrets about their past. In many novels, the hero is an orphan or some kind of unusual sibling, maybe not so much in a negative connotation, but they're just different than the rest of the people in the story. Usually, they have some incredible ability. The story begins um, with the hero typically being very young, if not an actual child, some might be in their teen years. Some examples of this again are Frodo Baggins from Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. Typically, this hero slowly gains knowledge of his past through legend, prophecy, lost and found, again, family members. They might encounter the mentor character who seems to know a lot more about them than he does. I'm just always thinking about Harry Potter when I talk about this. The only difference with Harry Potter is, I mean, all of these things, all of these elements of high fantasy can be applied to Harry Potter. But Harry Potter is also somewhat in the real world. So Harry Potter is an example. It's kind of a unique example that crosses between low and high fantasy. But all of this kind of, you know, falls under Harry Potter as well. It says, with that knowledge comes power and self confidence. The hero begins as a childlike figure, often naive, but then they mature rapidly. They experience a huge gain in fighting, problem solving abilities along the way. The plot of the story often depicts this good versus evil type theme. Another element of high fantasy is there's typically a wise old man as a mentor. And usually these characters are very likable. They provide the main character with advice. Some famous examples, we have Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, Dumbledore from Harry Potter, and even Merlin in the Legend of King Arthur legends. And then finally, again with the theme, there's typically this good versus evil theme. It's a common concept in high fantasy. The character of evil is often an important concept in a work of high fantasy. In many of the works, this conflict marks a deep concern with moral issues, and that's why the tone is very serious, because it speaks for all of humanity. It's this good versus evil. How are you gonna, you know, resolve temptation? There's all kinds of different levels to these themes. So, those are your characteristics of high fantasy. And again, if you need to pause, go ahead, but I'm gonna go on. So, low fantasy, not a lot to this compared to high fantasy. Whereas high fantasy has made up worlds involved, low fantasy is set in the real world. And they have a few of the fantastical elements. Matilda is a really good example of this, and we saw a good presentation on this the other day, or the other week. The characters in a low fantasy are typically haunted by dark pasts or character flaws where conventional fantasy elements such as magic and elves and dwarves are lacking or they're absent. They might have a few of these things, but the primary setting is the real world, and so a lot of the fantastical creatures are left out. And in low fantasy, there are many shades of gray where the main character is often the anti-hero. And on our presentation for Matilda, we talked about how, oh gosh, I can't remember, but how the ending was very different. The original ending was very different, and they had to change it. So that was just a good example of how, the main character in a low fantasy might not be as heroic or inspirational, perhaps, as the hero in a high fantasy. So those are your notes, and really that's all you need to copy down. But I want to spend the rest of this presentation introducing you to Peter Pan. This is my typical PowerPoint, so there's some questions, and it's kind of weird that I'm not there to ask you these questions, but you can think about them. I'm hoping you know the story of Peter Pan. I was surprised at how many people had not seen a lot of Disney movies, which is totally fine. But Peter Pan is not just a Disney movie. It's ingrained in a lot of our culture. There's been a lot of adaptations to Peter Pan. There's the movie Hook with Robin Williams, and there's plays, and I mean, it's just, we have the Peter Pan syndrome with psychology. So Peter Pan is very much a part of our American culture, even though it originated in England. James Matthew Barrie, J.M. Barrie, is the author of Peter Pan, and it was originally a play. I'll talk about him in a second. But here are just some questions to consider since I'm not there for you to answer. Have you seen a version of the play? Have you seen the Disney cartoon version? The movie Hook, Robin Williams. The movie Finding Neverland, which we are actually going to watch next week. Johnny Depp. It was originally a play, but then James Barrie also wrote a novel version, and we're going to actually read a bit of that today. And something else I want you to consider today says many controversies exist with Peter Pan. For this unit, we're going to explore Barrie's influences in writing it, and the different perspectives of parents and children, the theme of innocence and growing up. So it's not just a little old kid's tale, even though a lot of people might assume that it is. There's some depth here, there's some fantasy elements, and there's some pretty controversial themes with adults and kids reading this story. So in case you were not aware of the basic plot, it's about Peter Pan. He's an orphan. He does have magical powers, although he's not really like a wizard or anything, but he can fly, he can do special things. And one night he arrives in the nursery of the Darling children in London, and the Darling children are Wendy, John, and Michael. And basically he teaches them to fly. He introduces them to Never Never Land, inhabited by fantastical characters including fairies, the fairy Tinker Bell, the Lost Boys, and the pirate Captain Hook. And these are images from the Disney film, but we have Mr. Darling, and he's just like he's very strict. He doesn't like imagination. He's very concerned about fitting in to society. And he thinks that he and his family are extremely important. And you have Mrs. Darling, and that's obviously his wife and the mother of the children. And she just wants everything so. She's very proper, she's prudent, and she loves her children very much. She's very organized and neat and tidy, and she coddles her children much to Mr. Darling's displeasure at times. And then you have Nana, and these are kind of the adults in the story. Nana is basically the Nana. She's the dog. She's a Newfoundland sheepdog. She's their guardian, their caregiver, almost, their babysitter. And she's very kind and watchful and conscientious. And then you have the Darling children. You have John. He's the second oldest. He's the middle child. And as often is the case with middle child or children, he strives for attention. Michael is the youngest, and he's very, very young and naive, and he has to be taken care of and pampered. And Wendy, being the oldest and the only girl, she's very motherly. She's very much like her own mother, very orderly and neat. And like I said, she is the oldest. And then we have our Neverland characters, our fantasy characters. Obviously, we have Peter Pan, who is the boy who never grew up. He kind of represents the child in all of us. He wants to have a mother, although he might stubbornly not admit it at times. He's very adventurous. He is mischievous. He's kind of our anti-hero, where he's not just picture perfect and inspirational. And he's very rebellious. Tinker Bell is also not a very perfect character. She's very jealous of Wendy. She loves Peter Pan, and she's just kind of the stereotypical not nice female in this story. And then we have Captain Hook, who is the villain. He's the scoundrel. He's the leader of the pirates. He hates Peter Pan, and he is very much afraid of the crocodile. And that's the basic plot of Peter Pan, and you're going to read the first 3 chapters in just a second. But I want to end with talking about the author, James Barrie. He was born in 1860 in Scotland. He was raised by his mother. He had 9 brothers and sisters, and loved his mother very much. But when he was 6 years old, his older brother David, who he kind of hints was his mother's favorite, tragically died in a skating accident, and Barrie spent the rest of his childhood trying to replace his brother for his mourning mother. It's very sad, and we're going to see this in Finding Neverland in the movie, if you haven't seen it before. This attempt to replace a forever young David would take its toll on the rest of Barrie's adult life and his writing. He could be described as small and shy, and as a man he stood a little more than 5 feet and was quiet and awkward around women. He was married, though, and I'll talk about that in just a second, too. But this event where he was 6, where he lost his brother, that's the real key event in his life that made him grow up. I mean, I think he always yearned to have a childhood, and so that's kind of the inspiration for Peter Pan. This is Barrie's own biography of his mother. He said, "The room was dark, and when I heard the door shut and no sound come from the bed, I was afraid, and I stood still. I suppose I was breathing hard, or perhaps I was crying, for after a time I heard a listless voice that had never been listless before say, 'Is that you?' I think the tone hurt me, for I made no answer, and then the voice said more anxiously, 'Is that you?' again. I thought it was the dead boy she was speaking to, and I said in a lonely voice, 'No, it's not him, it's me.' Then I heard a cry, and my mother turned in bed, and though it was dark, I knew she was holding out her arms. After that, I sat a great deal in her bed, trying to make her forget him, which was my crafty way of playing physician." So the 6-year-old is trying to console his mother, who won't get out of bed. She's so depressed because she's lost her other son, his James's brother, and it's just a real tragic thing to read and consider. Fortunately, though, for Barrie, as he grew up, he was very successful as a writer. He got his start at Nottingham Journal after graduating from Edinburgh University. Before this time, though, he had already been captivated by the theater. He loved play. He wrote several short stories and several successful books, but he wrote his first play, Ibsen's Ghost, and he followed this with some other plays, and he met his future wife, the actress Mary Ansell, who you can see here. And the marriage was not a success, though. In its duration, he wrote his most successful plays, The Little Minister, The Admirable Crichton, and obviously Peter Pan in 1904. He wrote Peter Pan as a tribute to the sons of his friends Sylvia and Arthur Llewellyn Davies. Now, this story is depicted in the movie Finding Neverland, although Arthur is left out of it. He in the film has died before Barrie even meets the family, so it's a little bit different. But in real life, they were very good friends. It was distinctly different from the previous, more mature material that Barrie had written. Peter Pan was a fantasy, but not any mere fairy tale. Like Peter Pan himself, Barrie was a boy who refused to grow up. Barrie took such elements of life as his awkwardness with yet dependence upon women, his love of children, and his own longing for childhood, and he shaped them into this one of the best love stories of all time, Peter Pan. And here's a picture of the book in 1912. He called it Peter and Wendy. Originally, like I said, it was a play in 1904, and then several years later he wrote a novel. He went on to write more plays, and they were all very well received. On a more personal note about his marriage, his wife divorced him in 1908, and in that same year, Arthur Llewellyn Davis, this family that inspired Peter Pan, he died of cancer. And in 1910, his wife Sylvia also died, and Barrie was left to take care of all 5 of the Davies boys, whom he treated like his own children. In later years, Barry was made a baronet. He received several honorary degrees, so he was very successful, and he took a father role over these boys. And he actually died in 1937 after a very long, successful life. I chose a few excerpts from the novel just because I love them so much, and you're going to read a bit of them in a minute, but this excerpt says, "I don't want ever to be a man," he said with passion. "I want always to be a little boy and to have fun. So I ran away to Kensington Gardens and lived a long, long time among fairies." And so they actually have a statue, you can see it's the picture on the right, of Peter Pan in Kensington Gardens. So that's pretty neat that they're paying homage to this author. I like this one too. It says, "She gave him a look of the most intense admiration, and he thought it was because he had run away, but it was really because he knew fairies. Still, he liked them on the whole, and he told her about the beginning of fairies. You see, Wendy, when the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about. And that was the beginning of fairies." Mrs. Darling, well, actually, I'm going to skip this because we're going to read a little bit. So what I want you to do is to read the editorial about Peter Pan first, and then there's 3 questions I want you to respond to. And then for the rest of class, I want you to do the article and the questions, read the excerpt from the novel, which is chapters 1 through 3, complete the entire reading guide, and then that's about it. That should take you the rest of class. Again, be wonderful for whoever's in here. Absolutely no phones should be out. Be good, and I'll see you tomorrow. What you don't finish will be homework. So the goal is to be done by the end of class, but if not, you have some homework to do. All right, I'll see you tomorrow.